Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show with me, Bev Turner, this evening. Now, one policy that Labour were very vocal about prior to the election was their intention to slap 20% VAT on private school fees. They claim that this would raise £1.3 billion, which would fund 6,500 new teachers. But does it feel to you like a cruel and vindictive policy designed to divide? Well, joining me to discuss this, our education expert Tom Bewick and political commentator Aaron Bastani is still with me. Aaron, let's start with you. It felt a little bit to me like the mask slipped with Labour when they were so wedded to this idea from the start. 1.3 billion sounds like a lot of money in the grand scheme of things. It isn't a huge amount. But the people that will be targeted by this will be those children who are at private school, who then have to move and change their whole life, those kids, to move into a state school because their parents can't afford to keep them there. And yet everybody that I've spoken to from Labour is totally unmoved by that prospect.
Well, I think they're probably unmoved because they look at this through a sort of utilitarian lens and they would say, well, that might be a little bit bad, but this other thing, which is really bad, needs to be addressed, and that's our political priority, which is the condition of state schools in this country. The question is, of course, how much money is it going to raise? If this raised 2 billion, which is the top number, I think you'd have far fewer skeptics. Some people are saying, well, actually, you'll have people move into the state system, ergo, you're going to raise less tax, you're going to have to spend more because more people in the state system, etc. So where are we? If it doesn't raise anything, you're going to have a lot more critics. Let's say it's somewhere in the region of, like you say, around about 1 billion. My personal view is these are private businesses, so A, they should pay VAT, but secondly, they can adapt. You know, if you talk to people actually in the private school sector, they say the money now, the growth market is overseas students. That's where all the money is coming from. Okay, well, raise the fees on those guys then. Have a different fee setup for domestic students, UK nationals, and kids. You are businesses, you're going to have to innovate in terms of covering your cost base and providing an affordable product to consumers. We say that with regards to every other business. Why can't we say it here? So I think it's a sensible way to proceed. Look at it for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. I think you have to work in partnership with the entire education system, private and public, and reassess. But I personally think on principle, if you're a private business selling goods and services in the private market for prices, you should pay VAT.
But those overseas students, so you're talking specifically about boarding schools there? Is that what you mean? So kids who...
Overwhelmingly, yeah.
Kids who are sent over from Dubai, the parents live in Dubai, Hong Kong, wherever, they send their children to boarding school here, commonly, and you think they should be charged more because they aren't living here?
Well, I don't know, but I would say on an ad hoc, basis, I think these are businesses. I think many will be able to absorb the cost. Some are going to struggle to absorb the cost, right? And I think that's what we're going to work out over the next several years. Some are going to struggle to cost. Many of them won't, of course. Many of them are very profitable, they're very well run. But like I say, these are private businesses. And normally when we have any sort of industrial sector and we have businesses which are struggling, we say, well, the market will decide. There might be consolidation, they might make cost savings, they might introduce new innovations, and that's going to lead to higher productivity. That's generally the mindset we have with the private sector, with market systems.
Tom,
and I don't see why it's not the case here.
Tom, you're an education expert. What do you think the real world implications of this are going to be for the education system?
Hi, Bev. Look, first of all, I agree that the state education sector needs more resources. We're spending 8% less on education than we were in 2010. And actually, if you look back through history, and I just completed a book on the history of education, actually, over the last 150 years, it was the Labour government of James Callaghan that spent more on education as a proportion of our national wealth than any government since. And I think this policy actually is politically wrong-headed, and really for 3 reasons. The first, it's actually quite a performative policy in the sense that it gives voters the impression that by whacking a tax, which I believe is a double tax actually, on education, on private education, that this money will be then redistributed in a very progressive socialist way to the state sector in order to pay for new teachers that we need, and importantly for the breakfast clubs that we need in our deprived areas. But I think, as Aaron was just saying there, tops this will raise about £1.9 billion is the figure that Bridget Phillipson gave to a House of Lords Select Committee. Actually, the governments before the current government came in, but under the last government, officials said it would only raise £900 million. But the point is, there will be displacement from the private sector into the state sector. So it's performative from that point of view. It's a double tax in that, again, Aaron says, well, these are private businesses. Actually, most are incorporated as charities, and charities don't pay on a lot of these kind of services that they deliver as part of their charitable objects. And one of the things I'm worried about, someone that's been a CEO of several charities over the years, is that this is going to open a whole Pandora's box where actually charities are going to have to start charging VAT on more of the things that they offer for public good. And just finally, why actually this is a wrong-headed policy politically, it does nothing about the class ceiling in our country. The permanent secretaries of Whitehall, 60% of them went to private schools. 65% of our judges went to private schools. Where in this policy is the progressive nature that will actually lead to a redistribution of opportunity and not just going on a raid of middle-class parents who can afford to send their kids to private schools?
It's such a good point, Aaron, because the billionaires who can afford to send their children to private school, the multi-millionaires, they will not be touched by this 20% VAT. So what you're going to get is those parents who often have help from grandparents as well. Now, the doctors, the lawyers, the professions, if you like, who have spoken to granny and granddad and they've said, you know what, we're not going to leave you so much in our will, but we want to put this into the kids' education now. Those families are the ones who are going to be hit by this. It's almost like if it's not broken, don't fix it. This sort of two-tier system is ideologically, of course, fundamentally, of course, it's sort of wrong in inverted commas that you can pay to give your child an advantage in life. If I had my way, I'd wave a magic wand, close all the private schools, but raise the standard beautifully of all the state schools. Wouldn't that be a utopia that we could live in, where they all had football pitches and swimming pools and, you know, amazing after-school care? And that's not the real world we live in, unfortunately. So how are we going to encourage, as Tom was saying, this idea of social mobility with those sort of middle class, if you like, the lower middle classes who are trying to scrimp and save to get their kids to school? Those are the ones that are going to be ending up just feeling like there's nothing to aspire to.
Well, we already have a very rigged school system in this country. We got rid of grammar schools a long time ago in many places, not all of them, but many places. And what we have instead is selection, not by the 11 plus, but by where you live. We have a postcode lottery. So if you live in a nice middle class neighbourhood, you tend to have really nice schools. And if you live in a poorer neighbourhood, you have poor schools. And that is deeply unfair and deeply unjust. And it's an outcome of education reforms over the last 50, 60 years, which people didn't expect or foresee. And I totally buy that critique. But in terms of those state schools generally gets a decent deal. In terms of the people that can't afford to stay on with regards to these particular institutions, again, I understand, but the point is, what other private enterprise doesn't have to pay VAT? Now, some people say education is a public good, it's very useful. I mean, so's you know, renovating a house. There are lots of public service. So is feeding somebody, right? Tesco does stuff which is really useful for us. It means when you go out, you can buy bread and eggs and milk. That's really socially useful. If we didn't have that network of logistics and food distribution, we'd be in trouble pretty quick. But we pay VAT on it. So I just, as a purely, it's not about even necessarily, you don't have to go to fairness. You don't have to go to all those places. You should just say it's a business. There's prices involved, there's a market system, it's voluntary. Why aren't they paying VAT? Personally, I would actually introduce VAT on everything except food. That includes books, printed matter, kids' clothes, people might get upset, and I would bring it down. I think ideally VAT should be lower than it is, but the fact is, you have something which is a for-profit market system, which is private schools, there should be VAT.
Doesn't this raise the issue, Tom, though, about the role of how much we value children? Because Aaron sounds a little like the child catcher there from Chitty Bang Bang. Like, he wants to tax kids' clothes, he doesn't care where they go to school, and it's just as useful if you're selling food in Tesco's. Isn't the point that children are important? The next generation are critically important, and their well-being. Maybe we've lost sight of that as a society.
I think we have, and I think Aaron frankly has lost sight of that as well, as someone that I would consider, he and I are both on the same sort of left-leaning side of progress. VAT is one of the most regressive taxes there is on poor and middle-income people. You've only got to talk to any standard economist and they'll tell you that. But just coming back actually to a really important point Aaron made about what would be a progressive education policy then in the state sector. He mentioned house prices. It's why, for example, if Labour was really being true to its its roots, like, for example, Anthony Crosland's famous 1065 circular, when he was Education Secretary, that began that process of dismantling the segregation of the 1944 Education Act. That's why we got comprehensive education. We only have about 165 grammar schools left in the country. Why doesn't a Labour government put a levy on house prices? Why doesn't a Labour government, for example, say to aspiring working class parents living often in peripheral housing states across the country, therefore they tend to get trapped in catchment areas where the schools are not always, for example, rated good or outstanding? Why doesn't it give those working class kids a break and say to those parents, you can send your kids to any school, including any outstanding school that might be within
It's a very good point.
City area.
It's a very good point. The clock has beaten us, unfortunately, but fascinating. Thank you so much, Tom Bewick, Aaron Bastani. Big issue.